The ocean is black glass under a hot, breathless sky. On a Japanese flagship's bridge, exhausted officers lean over plotting tables, waiting for a pause that never comes. Far to the east, the horizon blinks with heat lightning, and then with something else. Brief, unnatural flares where American task forces live on the water like cities. Engines throb through the hull. Lookouts report fresh radar pips. Another American strike forms before the last one lands. It makes no sense. Flight decks cannot be bottomless. Fuel cannot be infinite. Yet the enemy's carriers keep launching, hour after hour, as if the Pacific itself were feeding them. Across that dark sea, the truth is quiet and methodical. Blacked-out silhouettes slide alongside in perfect station-keeping. Hoses snake across the void under swaying. In the decades before World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy was shaped by a single conviction. A fleet should fight one. Perfect battle. Everything, training, ship design, even logistics, was built around that ideal. The battleships of Admiral Yamamoto's generation were meant to strike a crushing blow near home waters, where fuel depots and repair yards stood close behind. Endurance was never the goal. Precision and firepower were. Japan's islands lacked oil. Its tankers crossed half the world to bring fuel from Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. Every drop that reached the fleet was guarded like treasure. To waste fuel at sea, merely for practice, was unthinkable. Ships sailed from fixed bases, refueled in port, and returned to fight again. The ocean between operations was empty, silent, and slow. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy was beginning to think differently. American planners, watching Japanese expansion, saw that any future war would stretch across thousands of miles. Bases could be destroyed. Islands could fall. The fleet itself would have to become self-sustaining, a moving city with its own heartbeat of supply. In the 1930s, experiments began quietly at sea. Old tankers were modified with winches and hoses. Destroyers crept alongside to take on fuel while underway, both ships rolling in opposite directions. The technique looked absurd, two steel walls shifting yards apart, but it worked. The first generation of oilers and tenders was born, and with them a new doctrine: mobile logistics. Japanese observers noted these tests but dismissed them. Too complex, one admiral wrote, too dependent on machinery and weather. Their own fleet oilers were few and slow, built only to shuttle fuel between bases. No one imagined transferring aviation gasoline in open seas while aircraft engines were still warm on the flight deck. Then came 1942. At Midway, Japan's carrier force lost 4 ships and half its naval aviators. The survivors retreated, not only beaten but stunned by how quickly the Americans replaced what they had lost. New carriers, Essex, Intrepid, Yorktown II, appeared within months, each escorted by destroyers and by something the Japanese did not yet fear: oilers. While Japan withdrew to rebuild, the U.S. Navy built a system. By 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz' staff had turned the scattered experiments into a doctrine called Service Squadron 8, a floating base of tankers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, and tenders that could follow the fleet anywhere. Instead of waiting for ships to return, the base went to them. The concept seemed mechanical, but it changed everything. A carrier task group could now steam indefinitely, refuel at sea, rearm, and strike again within hours. It was endurance as strategy, the exact opposite of Japan's decisive battle dream. By the time Japanese scouts sighted Task Force 58 in 1944, they thought they faced another temporary raid. What they saw instead was something new, a war machine that no longer paused. And as those first waves of American aircraft lifted into the Philippine dawn, Japanese officers asked the question that would haunt them for the rest of the war: how could they still have fuel left? Jackstays. Oilers pump hot fuel into thirsty carriers. Ammunition passes hand to hand. Bread, ice, spark plugs, and hope move in canvas bags that hum over the swells. On deck, sailors in red, yellow, and purple jerseys work by feel and dimmed lanterns. Valves click. Manifolds rumble. A whistle. Cast off. The ships shear apart and gather speed. Dawn shows nothing heroic. Just flight decks already spotted, elevators rising, propellers biting air. The Americans have built a moving port, and for the first time, Japanese admirals understand that the battle will not end. In the calm, blue vastness of the Pacific, the most powerful weapon of 1944 was not the carrier or the battleship, it was the oiler. After Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz faced a problem no strategist had solved before: how to move an entire fleet across 10 million square miles of ocean without stopping. The U.S. Navy could build ships faster than anyone on Earth, but what good were they if they ran dry halfway to Tokyo? The answer began with a handful of quiet, steel-bellied ships, the Cimarron-class fleet oilers. Originally designed to feed destroyers and cruisers, these ships were lengthened, hardened, and trained for one impossible task: to refuel entire task forces at sea, underway without slowing down. It was a ballet of balance and nerves. The oiler maintained a steady 12 knots, its engines humming at perfect RPM. The receiving carrier or cruiser crept alongside, barely 60 feet away, the ocean between them boiling white. Sailors fired shot lines across the gap, hauled over heavier cables, and finally the fuel hoses. If the seas turned rough, a wave could smash the ships together. A single spark could ignite both. Yet, hour after hour, they did it. Black oil and aviation gasoline flowing across the void as lookouts watched for periscopes. At first, the idea seemed fragile, but it soon became a science. Nimitz's staff formalized procedures, trained specialized replenishment divisions, and added ammunition, food, and spare parts to the process. Floating workshops carried engine blocks and propellers. Refrigerated ships delivered ice cream to carriers at anchor, a small luxury that reminded exhausted crews what they were fighting for. By mid-1943, the system had grown into something entirely new: Service Squadron 10, the world's first mobile base. It had no port, no coordinates, and no rest. It consisted of tankers, repair ships, ammunition vessels, hospital ships, and supply tenders. Wherever the fast carriers went, Service Squadron 10 followed. A city of logistics always just beyond the horizon. To coordinate this immense movement, Nimitz and Rear Admiral William "Bull" Halsey divided the Pacific into theaters of motion. While Task Force 58 struck one objective, the fleet train assembled behind it, forming atolls of steel that drifted between operations. When the carriers needed fuel, the oilers came to them. When the destroyers needed ammunition, supply ships rendezvoused in prearranged replenishment areas, silent gatherings hundreds of miles wide. The efficiency was astonishing. A task group could now operate for weeks without touching land. Destroyers no longer had to peel off to refuel. Carriers could recover aircraft, refuel, and relaunch within a single day. The Pacific Ocean, once a barrier, had become a highway. The heart of this highway beat in code names: Ulithi, Majuro, and Eniwetok. Coral atolls turned into floating warehouses. Anchored inside their lagoons, service squadron ships rearmed submarines, overhauled engines, even built new flight decks. An American pilot could crash one morning and fly again the next week from a newly repaired carrier. The Japanese watched in disbelief. Their own fleet was chained to geography. Every sortie required careful fuel planning. Every battle ended with a retreat to Truk, Palau, or Singapore for refueling. Tankers were few, slow, and unarmed. Once lost to submarine attack, they could not be replaced. In 1944, Japan's fuel production fell to half its 1941 level. Its fleet, the pride of the empire, began to suffocate on empty tanks. Meanwhile, the Americans had learned to turn oil into momentum. A destroyer could be fueled while steaming at 15 knots. A carrier could be resupplied mid-ocean in 12 hours. Entire air groups could rearm from the decks of ammunition ships without stopping flight operations. This was more than logistics. It was strategy made mechanical. Admiral Raymond Spruance described it best. Our strength is not merely in ships, but in the continuity of their motion. That continuity would soon prove unstoppable. In the spring of 1944, Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, assembled for Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas. Behind it sailed an armada of oilers, repair ships, and ammunition tenders, the Fleet Train. Together, they represented the world's first truly self-sufficient navy. Japanese scouts who sighted them reported more than 50 capital ships and over 300 escorts. They could not know that behind those ships were hundreds more, the invisible ones that carried the fuel, food, and ammunition that made 72 hours of continuous air assault possible. The Japanese had built fleets to win battles. The Americans had built fleets to end them, and in June 1944, when the fast carriers struck the Marianas without pause, that difference would decide the fate of the Pacific. Every great weapon has its shadow, and in the Pacific, that shadow smelled of fuel oil. While the headlines celebrated the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Hornet, there were no reporters aboard the ships that kept them alive. Their decks were slick, their quarters small, their work endless. These were the oilers, gray ships without glamour, crewed by sailors whose names rarely appeared on victory rolls. Their days began before dawn and ended long after sunset. They lived in a haze of salt, smoke, and heat. The engines never stopped. Pumps throbbed deep in the hull, pushing crude lifeblood through a maze of valves and hoses that ran like arteries. The smell of oil soaked everything: clothes, skin, even the food in the mess decks. When refueling began, the ship became a living machine. Orders cracked over loudspeakers. "Stand by to pass the hose." Sailors leaned out over the rolling ocean, waiting for the shot line to whistle through the air. They pulled, hauled, and locked heavy metal couplings into place. A single misstep could tear a man overboard or crush him between hulls. They worked in pairs, eyes locked, trusting each other more than gravity. Then came the signal: "Commence pumping." From the engine room rose the deep, steady thrum of pressure. Gauges trembled. Fuel surged through black hoses as thick as a man's leg. At sea, time slowed. An hour of tension for every 1,000 gallons. Both ships rose and fell together, their wakes merging into one boiling track. Every gust of wind carried the scent of risk. At night, the sea turned into a mirror. Only a sliver of red light glowed from the deck lamps, shielded to avoid detection. The refueling continued, hour after hour. Some sailors swore they could see the stars reflected in the slick sheen that followed them. Constellations trembling on a sea of oil. They called themselves the Black Gang, half in pride, half in irony. Their work never ended. When not refueling, they cleaned tanks, patched leaks, maintained pumps, and trained new men. Many were reservists or volunteers from the merchant marine, used to hardship but not to the precision demanded by naval life. Yet they adapted, improvising with pipe fittings, wrenches, and muscle memory. To the fleet, they were invisible. But to the carrier crews who depended on them, they were salvation. Pilots learned to read the fuel gauges differently, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, an oiler was already steaming to meet them. Destroyer captains plotted rendezvous points at night, guided only by radar and coded coordinates. It was faith made practical, a belief that logistics would never fail. The danger was constant. Submarines hunted the slow-moving oilers like wolves. The loss of even one could cripple a task group. On June 18, 1944, the USS Mississauga narrowly escaped torpedo attack during refueling operations. Her escort destroyers dropped depth charges so close that the blast bent her fuel manifolds. 2 months later, her sister ship, USS Mississauga, AO 59, would not be so lucky. Sunk by a Japanese Kaiten suicide torpedo at Ulithi, her burning fuel turning the lagoon into a lake of fire, but the line never broke. When one oiler fell, another filled the gap. The men aboard took pride in that constancy. They joked that their ships had no battle stars, only grease stains, yet without them there would be no battles at all. Every refueling was a quiet act of defiance. In the heart of the world's largest ocean, with no land for 1,000 miles, They made motion possible. They turned endurance into an art form, and while admirals drew arrows across maps, these men lived by one unspoken creed: keep the fleet moving. Their reward was anonymity. When the fast carriers returned to Pearl Harbor, crowds cheered their pilots and captains. The oilers anchored in the outer harbor, pumping again before anyone noticed they were there. But among themselves, they knew. They had built something larger than courage, a continuity of effort that no enemy could match. Later, when the war was nearly won, Admiral Nimitz would visit an oiler during refueling. Standing on the narrow catwalk between the two rolling ships, he watched the black hoses pulse with life and said quietly to the captain beside him, "This is what victory looks like." He was right. The Pacific War was not won by the ships that fired, but by those that fed. In Tokyo's naval academies before the war, officers were taught that the sea was sacred, a stage for decisive battle, not an assembly line. The teachings of Admiral Togo, victor of Tsushima in 1905, still defined doctrine: strike hard, strike once, and the enemy will not rise again. There was little room for patience, less for logistics. In that world, underway replenishment seemed almost dishonorable. Japanese naval planners believed war was an art of timing and courage, not arithmetic. To pause and refuel at sea, to rely on auxiliary ships instead of fighting ones, was seen as a dilution of spirit. It clashed with the samurai image that still clung to the Imperial Navy. Before 1941, Japan had the world's third-largest fleet, but its logistical arm was almost an afterthought. Tankers were few, small, and slow. Those that existed were converted merchant vessels, lacking the reinforced decks and powerful pumps needed for rapid transfer. In training exercises, warships took on fuel only in calm waters and daylight. The concept of continuous operation, of carriers fighting while refueling, was dismissed as unsafe and unnecessary. The few officers who suggested otherwise found themselves ignored. Captain Tomoichi Koyanagi, later Chief of Staff to Admiral Kurita, once proposed a specialized oiler division in 1938. His superiors rejected it outright. Fleet action will be decided before fuel runs out. This belief shaped every plan Japan made. Operations were plotted around fuel availability, not strategic opportunity. When Admiral Yamamoto planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, his staff calculated the range to the gallon. When Japan struck the Indian Ocean in 1942, the combined fleet returned home immediately afterward, leaving the theater empty. There was simply no way to sustain a presence. Even as the war dragged on, this doctrine never truly changed. Japanese shipyards produced more battleships and carriers, but almost no new oilers. Their logistics squadrons could barely support local operations, let alone a roaming fleet. The American concept of mobile service squadrons was viewed as wasteful. An army of mechanics instead of warriors, as one admiral wrote in his diary. Behind this arrogance lay hard reality. Japan had no oil of its own. Its supply lines stretched thousands of miles through seas patrolled by American submarines. Every convoy lost to torpedo attack tightened the noose. By 1944, half of Japan's remaining fuel came from synthetic refineries. Inefficient, fragile, and often bombed to rubble. The Imperial Navy's greatest ships, the Yamato and Musashi, often sat idle because there was not enough fuel to sail them. Meanwhile, American ships refueled in motion, day or night, in typhoons if necessary. Their oilers carried refined product ready for immediate use. Japanese vessels, forced to rely on unrefined bunker oil, fouled engines and burned less efficiently. Even when Japan captured oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, it lacked the refineries and transport network to make use of them. The cultural gulf widened into catastrophe. To the Americans, logistics was a science, precise, predictable, and unemotional. To the Japanese, it was background noise, beneath the dignity of strategy. Their officers prized initiative and aggression. Their staff work assumed that battles would be brief. They fought as though each operation would be the last. And eventually, it was. When Admiral Ozawa took command of the carrier fleet in 1944, he inherited a force magnificent on paper and hollow in reality. The ships were large, their air groups disciplined, their commanders brave, but their fuel reserves were measured in days. Ozawa understood the danger. In a report to Tokyo, he warned that our capacity for sustained operations is negligible. The reply was silence. Then, as reports arrived from the Marianas in June 1944, silence turned to disbelief. Japanese scouts described American carrier groups that fought for 3 days without pause, launching strikes morning and night. They assumed the reports were exaggerated, until they saw it themselves. While Japanese flight decks emptied after a single engagement, the Americans seemed to renew themselves overnight. Their destroyers refueled on the move. Their carriers rearmed at sea. Every morning, the same squadrons appeared again, fresh, fueled, and ready. It was the moment Japan's admirals realized that courage was no longer enough. The decisive battle they had waited for had arrived, but it was being fought not by men alone, but by an industrial machine that carried its own oceans of endurance. And when the last Japanese aircraft vanished into the smoke of the Philippine Sea, the admirals finally understood. The Americans had conquered not only the air, but the rhythm of the sea itself. Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944. The Pacific dawn was white with humidity and smoke. American radar screens pulsed with new contacts. Another inbound strike group from the west. Fighters scrambled, anti-aircraft batteries tracked, and the great carrier decks of Task Force 58 came alive again, for the 12th time in 36 hours. Engines coughed, roared, and steadied. Propellers blurred in the morning haze. To the men on deck it felt endless, as if the war had narrowed to one long day. From a distance, the American formation looked almost unnatural. 4 carrier task groups, ringed by battleships and cruisers, steaming in precise concentric arcs, and behind them, unseen, the lifeline. Oilers, tenders, ammunition ships, all moving as one. While the strike groups launched, tankers refueled destroyers astern. While one carrier rearmed, another sent planes aloft. The line of continuity never broke. Admiral Raymond Spruance called it the machine. It was not a metaphor. From his flagship Indianapolis, he watched aircraft take off, ships refuel, and reports arrive from Service Squadron 10 hundreds of miles behind, all synchronized by radio codes and charts that spanned the Pacific. At that moment, the U.S. Navy was the largest coordinated entity in human history. 500,000 men, 10,000 ships, and a rhythm of movement that made the ocean itself a weapon. Across the horizon, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet was running out of time and fuel. His carriers were magnificent but hollow. Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, now ghosts of their former strength. Each carried fewer than half its required aircraft. Each was short on aviation gasoline. Their pilots, once the best in the world, were young, undertrained, and nervous. Worse, their fleet oilers, slow and thin-skinned, had been forced to remain far to the rear, vulnerable to submarines. When Ozawa ordered his air groups to strike, he knew it was a gamble. He had fuel for 2 attacks, perhaps 3, before his carriers would have to retreat. His staff assumed the Americans would be similarly limited. They cannot sustain flight operations beyond a day, one officer predicted. They were wrong by 2 more days. At Tentiwak that morning, the first waves of Japanese aircraft rose into the sunlight and never returned. Radar-guided Hellcats intercepted them at range, shredding formation after formation before they could reach the American carriers. Pilots of the U.S. Navy's VF-15 squadron described the sky as a moving pattern of falling dots. The Japanese lost hundreds of planes before noon. Back aboard Taiho, Ozawa stared at his fuel gauges and the thin trails of vapor rising from his deck. Each launch consumed precious gallons. He sent urgent requests for replenishment, but his tankers were days away. Meanwhile, American destroyers were topping off their bunkers mid-ocean, never slowing. Carriers like Enterprise and Lexington rotated rearming cycles in rhythm, fed by ammunition ships that had rendezvoused only the night before. Even the wounded were treated in motion. Hospital ships cruised behind the task groups taking aboard casualties by motor launch. A pilot who crashed in the morning could be patched up, refed, and back in the cockpit by the next dawn. It was a rhythm that seemed superhuman to the Japanese, a tempo no human crew could maintain unaided. By dusk, the sea was littered with wreckage and burning oil. The Americans prepared for another launch. On the horizon, refueling lines flickered under the fading light. Silhouettes of oilers sliding between destroyers, pumping fuel even as enemy aircraft still burned on the water. Aboard the USS Neosho, sailors worked by feel, their gloves slick with oil and sweat. They had been awake for 40 hours. One looked up at the flight decks glowing orange in the sunset and muttered, "We're refueling the sunrise." They were. When dawn came again on June 20th, Task Force 58 launched its final pursuit strike. 550 aircraft chasing Ozawa's retreating fleet across 300 miles of ocean. It was the longest single strike in naval history. The returning planes landed in darkness, guided by deck lights hastily rigged with flashlights and oil lamps. The operation had lasted 72 hours without pause. The Japanese lost 3 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and the last of their trained aviators. The Americans lost the ability to count their own fuel consumption. Because it no longer mattered. Every gallon burned had already been replaced. From Tokyo, a stunned Admiralty demanded to know how the enemy could fight for 3 days without stopping. The answer, carried back through scattered reports and prisoner interrogations, was a single phrase repeated again and again. They refuel at sea. For Japan, it sounded like madness. For America, it was the sound of mastery. The third day began like the first, heat, haze, and the smell of burning fuel. But for Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, there was nothing left to give. His flagship Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, rolled gently in the swell, her engines coughing on the final drums of aviation gasoline. Around her, the scattered remnants of the Mobile fleet drifted like wounded animals. Radio silence had collapsed. Pilots were missing. 2 of his carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, had been torn open by torpedoes. A few destroyers still circled, their own tanks half empty. When Ozawa asked for remaining fuel reports, the numbers came back like epitaphs. 5%, 7%, 12%. It was over. To the west, the American formation still glowed faintly on the horizon, constant, organized, and terrifying. What the Japanese saw was not just power, but permanence. Even after 3 days of non-stop operations, the U.S. carriers looked untouched. Their decks were busy, their wakes still white. Behind them, the silhouettes of tankers and tenders moved steadily, as if the sea itself obeyed their will. In the Japanese wardrooms, disbelief turned into something colder. Officers compared notes and came to the same conclusion. The Americans no longer needed ports. They had created one in motion. They could fight anywhere for as long as they wished. On the evening of June 20th, Ozawa gave the order to withdraw. His ships turned west, crawling toward Okinawa. But the retreat itself became a death march. Fuel ran out before dawn. Destroyers went dead in the water. Crews siphoned fuel from disabled ships to keep flag vessels moving. When aviation gasoline became too precious for planes, it was poured into boilers instead. Sailors worked shirtless in suffocating heat, hand-pumping transfer lines between decks, scraping the bottoms of tanks with buckets. The ocean reeked of spilled oil and exhaustion. What had begun as the Empire's last great fleet maneuver ended as an act of survival. Meanwhile, to the east, Task Force 58 refueled again. Oilers slipped into position like clock hands. Hoses were secured, pressure tested, pumps engaged. The entire replenishment took less than half a day. By evening, the carriers were ready for another strike. Not because they needed one, but because they could. From his flagship Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance watched the replenishment through binoculars. To the untrained eye, it looked mundane. Ships steaming parallel, men hauling hoses, oil flowing. But Spruance understood what it meant. Every gallon that crossed those lines was another battle won without firing a shot. When reports of Ozawa's retreat arrived, Spruance did not gloat. He knew the truth. The Japanese had not been defeated by tactics, nor by courage. They had been defeated by mathematics. In Tokyo, the shock was total. The Imperial Navy had believed in its warriors, its spirit, its decisive battle doctrine. But the reports from the Philippine Sea destroyed that illusion. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were gone. 3 carriers lay on the seabed. The survivors limped home to find their oil depots nearly empty and their shipyards already under attack. One staff officer wrote bitterly, "We lost the war not when our carriers sank, but when the Americans built ships to feed their ships." That single sentence captured everything. From that moment, Japan's fleet ceased to be an offensive weapon. It became a symbol of past glory, trapped in its own geography. Without oil, without replacement pilots, it could no longer move freely. The Yamato herself, pride of the Imperial Navy, would spend most of the next 10 months at anchor. Too precious to risk. Too thirsty to sail. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed forward with machine-like patience. Their oilers followed them into new seas, to the Marianas, to Leyte, to Okinawa. They learned to refuel even during combat alerts, to exchange ammunition between decks as shells fell nearby. The sea had become their factory floor, and its assembly line never stopped. The Battle of the Philippine Sea entered history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that trivialized its deeper truth. It was not merely an air massacre. It was the day the old idea of naval war died. From that point onward, fleets were measured not by the number of their guns, but by the endurance of their logistics. When Ozawa finally reached Japan, he faced an impossible report to his superiors. The carriers were gone, the pilots dead, the fuel nearly exhausted. He described the American operations with quiet awe. They fought without pause, as if the ocean were their base. It was the highest form of respect an enemy could give. And for Japan, it marked the end of the sea as a battlefield, and its transformation into an American highway. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not end with explosions. It ended with stillness. When the last American carrier aircraft returned to deck that June night, the Pacific lay quiet except for the low thunder of refueling pumps. The Japanese fleet was gone, broken not by firepower but by arithmetic. For the first time in history, endurance had outgunned bravery. To the American crews who had fought for 72 straight hours, victory felt both immense and invisible. There was no decisive moment, no ship sinking in glory, only the slow realization that the enemy had simply vanished. Task Force 58 turned back toward the Marianas, its decks scarred, its fuel tanks full again, its machines still running. What followed was the practical application of dominance. In the months after the Philippine Sea, the U.S. Navy no longer advanced in leaps between bases. It rolled forward like a tide. The fleet train, that invisible line of oilers, repair ships, and supply tenders, grew into a moving metropolis. Service Squadron 10 at Ulithi became the nerve center of the Pacific War. More than 600 ships anchored together in a floating harbor the size of Manhattan. Here, battleships received new gun barrels, carriers new aircraft, destroyers new crews. Mechanics rebuilt engines on open decks, welders patched hulls between waves, and cooks baked bread for 100,000 men. Oilers came and went constantly, shuttling between Pearl Harbor, Eniwetok, and forward rendezvous points. The entire Pacific had become a conveyor belt. Every major operation that followed, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was powered by this living system. Task Force 38, Halsey's fast carriers, could now remain at sea for months. Fuel lines extended from Ulithi to the front like arteries. Destroyers no longer peeled off for resupply. They refueled in formation. Carrier decks never cooled. Japanese commanders watched in disbelief from their crumbling empire. Intelligence reports described oceans filled with ships, convoys, of oilers steaming where no merchant ships had ever gone before. Japan's own tankers were being sunk faster than they could sail. By late 1944, half the surviving Imperial Navy had been immobilized, not by attack, but by emptiness. When Admiral Toyota ordered the remaining fleet to sortie for the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, his staff protested. They knew the risk. There was fuel for only one voyage. Toyota's answer was fatalistic. If we do not go now, we shall never go at all. They went and never returned. Musashi and Yamato, symbols of Japan's might, sailed with half-empty tanks. Their final missions were suicide by design, one-way voyages powered by the last barrels of the Empire's oil. In April 1945, when Yamato went down off Okinawa under a sky thick with American bombers, she took with her the last dream of Japanese sea power. She died not of explosions, but of logistics. Meanwhile, the Americans kept refueling. While Japanese survivors clung to debris, U.S. oilers like USS Samaren and USS Neosho steamed calmly in formation, hoses stretched between ships, transferring black lifeblood under open skies. The ocean had become their infrastructure. By war's end, the scale was almost beyond comprehension. Between 1942 and 1945, American oilers delivered more than 130 million barrels of fuel at sea. No fleet in history had moved so far, so fast, or so continuously. The U.S. Navy had learned to turn motion itself into a resource. Japan, for all its brilliance in tactics and courage, had built a fleet designed for a sprint in a marathon world. Its officers had imagined victory as a single, perfect clash of arms. What they faced instead was a storm without an edge, an enemy that did not stop, did not tire, and could remake itself each dawn. After the war, captured Japanese admirals visited Ulithi and Eniwetok, walking the decks of American oilers and repair ships. They said little. One, standing aboard the USS Mispillion, ran his hand along the fuel line and whispered, "This is what defeated us." He was not wrong. From that day forward, navies around the world rewrote their doctrines. Every great power, Soviet, British, Chinese, built replenishment fleets of their own. But none could match the quiet confidence of the system born in the Pacific in 1944, the ability to turn the ocean into a factory floor and time into an ally. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world's oceans looked different. Not in shape, but in meaning. For thousands of years, sea power had meant controlling ports, protecting trade routes, and striking from the shore. After the Pacific War, that definition was obsolete. The Americans had proven that a fleet could live untethered, fed not by land, but by motion itself. The system they had created, the fleet train, did not disappear when Japan surrendered. It evolved. Service Squadron 10 became the model for every naval logistics command that followed. The men who once pumped oil into carriers over the Philippine Sea returned home and trained new generations in a doctrine no nation could ignore. During the Cold War, the United States built a global network of mobile supply groups, replenishment squadrons capable of refueling and rearming ships anywhere, in any weather. New tankers and supply ships, larger and faster, carried not just fuel but missiles, spare engines, and even nuclear warheads. Their names, Sacramento, Kilauea, Mount Baker, were rarely spoken outside naval circles, yet they were as vital as the carriers they served. Every U.S. carrier battle group that patrolled the Atlantic or Mediterranean was a direct descendant of Task Force 58. Each could remain at sea for months, replenished by oilers and tenders that crossed oceans like clockwork. When crises erupted, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, it was these invisible ships that made immediate response more than a slogan. Other nations took note. Britain, rebuilding its navy, developed its own Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The Soviet Union created replenishment tankers for its cruiser squadrons shadowing NATO fleets. Even Japan, humbled by its wartime failure, rebuilt. A maritime force with modern oilers, each one a quiet acknowledgement of lessons learned too late. The principle had become universal. A navy that cannot refuel itself cannot exist beyond its coast. And yet there was something deeper in that evolution. A philosophical shift. The age of decisive battle was over. No admiral would again gamble an entire fleet on a single day's clash. Victory would come not from a blow, but from the ability to remain, to persist, to sustain. The Pacific War had revealed the true measure of power, not destruction, but duration. In the decades that followed, the legacy of underway replenishment reached beyond the military. The global shipping industry, commercial aviation, even space exploration adopted its logic. Continuous operation, supply in motion, the removal of pause as limitation. The idea that everything must stop to be sustained vanished from modern strategy. The future belonged to those who could move and renew at once. By the 1960s, American replenishment groups were operating around the world like orbital systems, one in the Atlantic, one in the Pacific, one in the Indian Ocean. Their routes connected Guam, Pearl Harbor, Subic Bay, Diego Garcia, Norfolk, and Rhoda, a moving geometry of endurance. The fleets they served could strike from any direction, at any time, for as long as they wished. Even in peacetime, the silent choreography continued. Sailors hauled hoses across heaving decks, valves opened, and the dark tide of fuel flowed again. The same rhythm that had begun in 1944, unchanged except for the faces of the men. Most of them never thought of history. They simply did their jobs, unaware that their work sustained an empire of stability. When historians looked back on the Second World War, they called the Battle of the Philippine Sea the death of the Japanese Navy. But its true significance was greater. It was the birth of the modern world's operating tempo. It proved that mastery of motion could outweigh mastery of force. Today, every carrier that sails under any flag does so in the shadow of that revelation. When a U.S. strike group refuels under gray skies in the South China Sea or the Arabian Gulf, the scene is nearly identical to that first one. Ships rolling side by side, hoses swaying, men in colored jerseys working by instinct and trust. The same sound, the low hum of pumps, the muted clank of couplings, carries across the water. That sound is history repeating itself, quietly. For beneath all the technology, all the strategy, all the power, the truth remains what Admiral. Nimitz understood when he first saw those black hoses stretched across the sea. Control of the ocean does not belong to those who can strike the hardest. It belongs to those who can keep striking. War is often remembered for its explosions, the moments when ships burn or skies fall. But history is not always written in fire. Sometimes it is written in rhythm. The Japanese admirals of 1944 believed, in the sudden perfect stroke, a single decisive clash that would carve victory from courage. They had studied Mahan and Togo, worshipped precision, and prepared for one thunderclap of history. Yet the Americans had learned something else, that victory belonged not to brilliance, but to persistence. Underway replenishment was never dramatic. It made no noise on the battlefield, earned no medals, inspired no parades. But in the quiet between battles, when men slept on fuel hoses and the ocean swelled black and endless, it was there, the unseen heart beating beneath the surface of war. What the Americans discovered was not just a technique, it was a philosophy, that strength is not in the strike but in the ability to strike again, to move, to recover, to endure. In that realization lay the future. The aircraft carrier became not a weapon of a moment, but a weapon of motion, a platform that could sustain itself through distance and time. The fleet ceased to be a collection of ships. It became a single living organism, feeding, breathing, repairing, and fighting without pause. The Japanese saw it too late. Their fleets had been built for glory. The Americans had built theirs for continuity. And in war, continuity is everything. When the Pacific fell silent and the last refueling hoses were coiled on deck, the sea itself seemed to understand what had changed. It was no longer a barrier or even a battlefield. It had become a highway, one that stretched wherever human endurance could carry it. The men who served on those oilers, those decks, those endless lines of ships, they did not know they were changing history. They only knew that the line must never stop, and because it didn't, the world moved.